I think we should probably get started. And I know people are going to be continuing to file in, but we've just got some housekeeping and all. I'm Ken Turino. I'll tell you a little bit more about me in just a second. I want to thank you all for coming out and inviting in case studies in interpreting queer history. This section actually became a combination of two sessions. The other one was proposed by Danielle Bennett, and we did what we think is a nice Boston marriage here of those two programs. Danielle, I'm going to turn this over to you for a second in the next slide.
Thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to quickly do a land acknowledgement before we get started. Virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. We honor the traditions and the peoples indigenous to these lands, now known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the states of Maine and New York. And that group of people are the Pennacook, the Mohican, the Pocumtuck, the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Wampanoag, the Nauset, the Chappaquiddick, the Abenaki, the Wabanaki, and the Lenape.
Thanks, Danielle, for that. And we'll go to the next slide. So here you can see our agenda. And I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they're going to be presenting. I'll be doing a brief overview in just a moment, but it's really wonderful to be working with this great group of people, many of which I've had the pleasure of working with in other ways. So in order of our speakers today, the first one will be Meghan Holmes, who is curator of the Gibson House Museum in Boston. And she wears two hats because she's also the curator of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, located on Beacon Hill. Meghan holds an MA in Public History from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Our second speaker is going to be Danielle Bennett, a museum consultant and PhD student in the history department at CUNY Graduate Center. I had the pleasure of working with Danielle when she was a student in museum studies at the Tufts University. She has previously worked at the Alice Austin House. We'll be learning about that today, as well as on LGBTQ plus related projects at the New York Historical Society and for AK Cultural Planning. I'm going to put a plug here now because she is the guest editor of the Journal of Museum Education's Queering the Museum issue, which will be out in December 2020. I think that's a must-have. And when Danielle completes her segment, Marilyn Daly is the South Berwick Site Manager for Historic New England. She oversees the care, programming, and interpretation of both the Sarah Orne Jewett House Museum and Visitor Center, and the Hamilton House located in South Berwick, Maine. Previously coming to Historic New England, she was at the Canterbury Shaker Village, where she was the education manager. She has a Master of Arts in English from Hollis University. And our next and final speaker is Nicole Mello. Nicole specializes in queer history, a national park ranger, notice her outfit, at the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. They research and interpret the queer history of the site and those who lived in the home. They do everything and anything they can to shine lights onto the queer figures throughout history through programming, creative materials, and of course, lots and lots of research. Nicole Mello has also been creating virtual queer programming during the pandemic, and I've been fortunate to do some of the live walking tours and some of the virtual program, and they're outstanding.
Thank you so much.
Well, with that, next slide, please, Danielle. Both Marilyn and I work at Historic New England, the largest regional heritage organization in America. I hope many of you are familiar with that. And the topic that we're talking about, queer history, is important to us because several of our sites deal with queer history, but like many historic sites, ours are a good example, we're still trying to suss out the stories that have not been told. These are basically the home of wealthy white men. And I want to put today in my talk, my brief talk, put it in perspective of what else is happening in the historic house and historic site and historic museum field. Next, please, Danielle. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, here you can read my background. I'm not going to tell you, but I will tell you a little bit about the book that Max von Bolgeli and I edited. And it's all about how we can reimagining our historic house museums. And that's really what the focus of this talk is about today. And a lot of the lessons that I've learned have gone into this book, but also into the work that we're doing at Historic New England. Next, please. So I want to talk about what's happening in the field. More and more historic sites are discovering that they have a queer history. These are headlines from the Washington Post and the Advocate talking about interpretation. This was announced just exactly a year ago that Colonial Williamsburg, of all sites, is looking into that past, and their Vice President for Research and Historical Interpretation, Beth Kelly, said, sharing the history, this history, is vital if we are committed to telling a holistic narrative of our past. And I think that that's absolutely key. I want to put this a little bit more in perspective. Next, please, because it's not just talking about queer history. This is something that's going on throughout our field, and a lot of what's being talked at NEMA, telling the stories that have not been told. Monticello has, over the years, and really 25 years, been doing more research and talking about, takes a lot of time, the story of the enslaved people. And it was just in June 2018 that they acknowledged publicly in this recreation of Sally Hemings' room, there you see at the bottom, that Monticello is done avoiding Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, the mother of his children, several of his children, I should say. And they're using the words now of the children. One of the sons wrote about mom and dad to tell the story of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. Next, please. And bring it closer to home. You know, the Royal House Museum in Medford, probably known to many of you, known for its great Georgian architecture, the home of a slave trader, rum distiller and merchant, Isaac Royal. That was the story that was told. But in the last several years, they decided, the board and now working with new staff, to tell the story, next slide, of the enslaved people that were part of this complex. And they even changed the name to the Royal House and Slave Quarters. I urge you to go and check out the website because they've been doing some pretty amazing things. Next, please. More and more historic sites are also telling the story of women. The Bradford House in Duxbury is an American Association for State and Local History award winner. It really focuses in on the women of the house. Sarah Hinkling Bradford supervised the initial construction of this house when her husband was held captive by the French. After his death, the house was owned and operated by the women. Next slide. And the house focuses on their roles as Civil War nurses, as abolitionists. The house was a center in town for people coming in to talk about abolitionists and so on. So telling women's stories. Next, please. And many of you, I hope, are familiar with the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side. It was home to nearly 7,000 working class immigrants. And it tells the story of those immigrants, and one of the most moving museums that I know of. I've been on amazing tours at this site. And that's so relevant to all that we're talking about that's going on with immigrants today. Next, please. And I'm on the board, Vice President of the House of Seven Gables in Salem, Mass. What a lot of people don't know, it has layers of history like many of our sites do, but this was actually formed as a settlement house by a woman, Carolyn Emerton, and today we still serve the needs of the immigrants. Now the immigrants have changed. We're working with the Latinx community through ESL programs, through citizenship programs, and out-of-school programs. And I'm proud to be associated with that organization that's keeping up the initial mission. Next, please. But this is happening across the country. La Casa Cordoba was taken from the Cordoba family by the city of Tucson And it was turned into a museum of white colonialism, trying to erase the Latinx community history. That right is being wronged. That wrong is being righted now. It's owned by the Tucson Art Museum, and they have gone back now, and with the exhibitions you see in the lower right, telling the story of the Latinx family and not privileging the white settlers. Next, please. There are many sites now like this in Connecticut, which I've been fortunate enough to work on with Connecticut Landmarks, to reinterpret sites. This is a house that's under development. It's not open to the public, been opened very, very occasionally for the community to see the work that's being done, really important. But this house has many layers, but it's going to be talking about the owners that you see there, the older gentleman, Frederick Palmer, and his partner, lover, Howard Metzler. And they've been doing amazing research. So this is a site in development that I think is really important to know about. So watch for this to come online. Through grant-funded research, they're going to talk about the queer lives of these men. And next, please, my last slide. I want to talk about this site, which was reinterpreted in the last several years. This is owned by the Wisconsin Historical Society, and it's in Mineral Springs, as you can see. And these houses were built by Cornish miners, immigrants who came and settled in this area, worked in the mines. The buildings were essentially rescued by the couple you see on the lower right, Robert Neal and Edgar Hilliam. Now, for years, they really avoided talking about their relationship. But we know from their letters that they lived together in the same house. And now the interpretation has shifted to be more truthful, to be more holistic. And that's what we want to do with more and more of our sites. So with that, I hope to give you just a very, very quick, brief overview of what's happening in the field. And let's dig down now into some case studies. And then I'm going to come back and ask our panelists some questions. And then we definitely want your questions. So I'm going to turn this over to Meghan. Oh, forgot. Oh, that's good. Just go to Meghan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Meghan Gelardi Holmes. I'm the curator of the Gibson House Museum, which is a small historic house in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. Here it is. The house was built in 1859. It was occupied by 3 generations of the Gibson family and their employees between 1960 and 1954. And then in 1957, it was open to the public as a museum. We've been open ever since, and visitors can come take a guided tour that explores class and culture in Victorian Boston. Next slide, please. So today I want to introduce you to Charlie Gibson, this gentleman here on the left. He's the museum's founder. Charlie was a writer, a preservationist, and a real Boston character. He was also a gay man. And because Charlie is the founder, his story is integral to the museum's story. In 1934, at the age of 60, he moved back to his childhood home to take care of his ailing mother. She died later that year, and he began a 20-year project to turn his house into a museum. This image here on the right is of Charlie's study. That was originally his father's bedroom, but when he moved back home, he turned it into his personal study and kind of living space. It looks like the height of the Victorian era, but in fact, this is 1930s decorative choices. So I feel like that tells us a lot about Charlie. He was incredibly nostalgic for the Boston of his youth, and he preserved the house and furnishings in keeping with the 1880s. His sexuality is tied up in all of this, in his relationships with his family, in his literary career, in his passion to preserve a tangible legacy for himself, but the museum has not always talked about Charlie as a gay man. In 2018, we decided we would rewrite the house tour for a whole host of reasons, but the most significant change we made is that we wanted to discuss Charlie's sexuality. So now on every single tour, guides introduce Charlie as a gay man. At the same time that we were sort of working on this and expanding our interpretation, a local scholar and a good friend to the museum, Trip Evans, was working on research for a book of his about gay men interior designers and preservationists in New England, of which there are many. And he unearthed some really fantastic letters in Historic New England's archives. You can see an example of one here. And several of these mention Charlie and his relationships, his romantic relationships or physical relationships with other men of their social circle. At the same time that we were sort of dealing with all of this, Boston Pride approached us to write a short piece about Charlie for their annual Pride Guide. It felt like the perfect confluence of events. And we knew that Charlie's story warranted a bigger focus. In many ways, his is the most fascinating part of the house, in my opinion anyway. So we decided to write a specialty tour of the house through Charlie's lens. I put together an advisory committee of scholars, museum professionals, and activists, which included both Ken and Danielle. And they really helped us think through the history we might present to visitors and how to use the material culture in the house in a new way. Next slide, please. One of the things that was great about finding these letters, and there were many, was that they gave us the opportunity to reread Charlie's own writings in the context of same-sex attraction. So in his early 20s, Charlie traveled around France with a self-styled count, and under a pseudonym, he wrote this book that you can see on the right about those travels and that experience. And while the book is not explicit about the nature of their relationship, we learned from the letters that they were having a romantic relationship, and that was known both to his family and to wider Boston society. And once you know that, you read the book, and I pulled two quotes here, and you can see that this is a formative romantic relationship for Charlie. Next slide, please. So one of the things, we launched our specialty tour, Charlie Gibson's Queer Boston, in June 2019, with a weekend of tours and an evening reception co-sponsored by Boston Pride. You can see some photos here. It's always nice to see the house not empty, right, but with people in it. One of the things we wanted to do with the tour was to widen our perspective beyond Charlie himself and talk about a broader experience of same-sex attraction in late 19th and early 20th century Boston. So we did that by talking about Boston marriages, the trial of Oscar Wilde, and the culture of bachelorhood and deep male friendships. And the goal was to really sort of get at the fluidity of sexuality and sexual attraction in this period, a period that I think we all think of as very rigid. And it was sort of fun to play with that a little bit, and also use Charlie as a jumping off point to talk about a bigger history. I think that the program was a huge success. We brought in a new audience. I spoke with one person who said, if I had known there was a gay story here, I would have visited sooner. And you can see some of the other really nice quotes that we, or people told us or wrote in our valuations. One of the things that was gratifying to me was that our audience skewed younger than it normally does. And I felt like that was a sign that we were offering something contemporary and relevant. And so now we're kind of on what's next. Since then, we've aimed to offer the tour regularly. We're trying for monthly. We're sort of still getting our sea legs on that. We have offered it twice virtually this past summer. But I think our real work is to deepen our connections with LGBTQ history and with the queer community by making it clear that we're a site for queer stories. And it's an ongoing process. I think there's a lot of work to do, but I am glad that the museum is moving in the right direction there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghan. Hi, I'm Danielle. I am a graduate student in history at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York, where I'm coming to you from today. And Ken already graciously plugged it for me, but I would love it if you went out and got the winter issue of the journal Museum Education to read more about queering the museum in general, not just queering historic house museums like we're talking about today. I'm going to talk to you today about the Alice Austen House, which is a site in New York where I have worked and also that I have researched as part of my master's thesis. So this is the Alice Austen House. It is a beautiful house in Staten Island, New York, and it is a family house originally built. It used to be a one-room farmhouse that Alice Austen's grandfather purchased and bought, and expanded and made it into this gorgeous little gingerbread thing that you see today. It's right on the harbor, and it has the most photographic grounds I think I've ever seen, and which is great because Alice Austen is known for being an early female photographer. That's her with the bicycle in the top corner. She was a glass negative photographer for most of her life. She was born in 1866, and she is famous for basically having the opportunity, having the wealth and the means and the time and the inclination to travel around New York and other places as well and photograph the scenes that she saw. So one thing she used to do is she worked for a period of time photographing the conditions of the quarantine hospitals in the island where the quarantine hospital for the city of New York was before Ellis Island was built. She also was known for her street types, which are an image example of which is in the lower corner here, where she would take her 50 pounds of photographic equipment and her bicycle, go over to Manhattan using the ferry, and would ride around and photograph immigrants on the Lower East Side. These are two women selling eggs on Hester Street. The House Museum itself was opened in the mid-'80s. Alice's life took a strange tumble. She lost her fortune in the Great Depression. She mortgaged this family house that she lived in and ultimately lost that house. It was foreclosed on. She squatted in it. She eventually was kicked out of it. It changed hands several times. Alice ended up swearing that she had no earthly possessions and going to live at the Staten Island poorhouse, the Staten Island farm colony, which is a poorhouse. The house itself was abandoned for a time and was saved from demolition and site development in the 70s by a group of local neighborhood activists and also artists and photographers who were interested in saving the house and dedicating it to her work. So this is what it looked like just a couple of years ago, really 2018, this picture is representative of. This is a picture of how the house looked, the dining room of the house looked, during the most of its history. The Austin house they did not have any possessions for this house, but they did have photographs that Alice had taken of the house. And they went around and they purchased objects that resembled the objects in Alice's photos and redressed the house to look like it sort of looked when Alice might have lived there. It was not especially dynamic. And what was the most compelling about the house was that some of the bedrooms had been turned into a gallery space for contemporary photography. So the rotating exhibits of contemporary photography were the major draw to the house, that and its beautiful landscaped position on the seashore. But Alice's life and her photography are interesting for some other reasons. Alice was a person who was in love with other women. She lived most of her adult life, 50 plus years of it, in one relationship with one woman named Gertrude. And she lived with Gertrude in that house for 30 years. We can see Alice's life experience in some of her photography, some of which is right here. This upper corner image is a self-portrait of her and 3 of her friends. It's called the Darned Club. It's taken on the water's edge right outside of her house. And the Darned Club is a reference to the something that her male friends had said about how hard it was to get into their clique, that darned club of those women. And in the other picture, you can see in the lower corner, this is a picture of Alice and 2 of her friends dressed up in their brother's and father's clothing. And Alice is actually seated in the middle with a cheekily positioned umbrella between her legs. So we can understand, because of Alice's position of relative wealth and relative freedom and a fairly indulgent family that she lived with and didn't curtail her actions, that Alice had a life that was much less conventional than we might have assumed from some of her other photographs. And then as her family died and also moved on with their lives, Alice remained in the house, and then Gertrude came to live with her eventually when Gertrude's family situation with her mother and sister freed up in a way that Gertrude felt that she could leave them to go live with Alice. We have always known about this history of Alice's life experience, but the House Museum did not talk about it for the first 30 years of its existence. And the main keepers of this flame of information about Alice's life were lesbians and historians that were interested in lesbian material. So in the upper corner here, we see this magazine, Dyke Quarterly. We see that image that we saw just a minute ago. This is a 1976 magazine for lesbians, and they have used Alice's image as their own work. We also to represent their own work. This other image here is with the Dyke Preserver is a photograph from 1995 when the Lesbian Avengers staged a protest on Alice's front lawn, demanding that Alice's lesbian history be told at the house. And they dressed as sailors and brought Dyke Preservers to crash an event that the house was hosting at the time. So we've always known, but the house has not actually done the research until recently. There's a lot of board opposition to this, this strain of the narrative of Alice's life. In 2012, there was a new director, Janice Monger, who decided that it was past time to really address this issue. And she worked with the board to say that we are going to start talking about this. She always says that it's a matter of education, educating the board, educating ourselves on staff, and then educating the public about this narrative. But what she started with, and you'll find, I found in my research that many of the houses that start talking about queer narratives start small, with one image or one line or one program. In this case, the Austin House started with this photograph, which is a penny portrait of Alice and Gertrude that was taken in 1915. It was hung on the wall by the front door, which also features Alice's family tree, which was a wall of photographs of all of Alice's friends and family, except for Gertrude. In this way, the Austin House started to put Gertrude back into the narrative and do the research that was needed to more fully realize what was actually the bulk of Alice's life lived with Gertrude. So the Austin House has done a lot of work over the past few years and has pursued several grants to do this work. So the first grant that they got was an NEH planning grant to contract with several scholars who researched different aspects of Alice's life, including her sexuality, and then presented that at the Whitney Museum in a roundtable discussion. So you can see the flyer for that event on the side of this slide. At the same time, they were also working with NYC LGBT Historic Sites, which is an online historic preservation organization that works to preserve New York City's queer history and queer architectural history. So the LGBT Historic Sites worked with the Austin House to get the Austin House added to the LGBT significance lists on the national and New York State historic registers. And then also, once they had done the preliminary research and gotten these listings in place, they then applied for a larger NEH grant. They received a $250,000 grant to redo their permanent display. And so that actually debuted last summer. And this is what it looks like. This is the new and revised and improved family tree, which now features Alice as a small child in that center image. And then you can see over on the side a larger image of Alice. There's obviously many images of Alice. But most importantly, there's now this beautiful portrait of Gertrude, no longer that penny portrait of the two of them together. This is instead a much more romantic image that Alice took of Gertrude front and center on that family tree. And the rest of the house is much more of a traditional museum experience now, but that uses more artifacts from the Austin family collection, letters and images and photographic equipment that was actually Alice's stuff. So even though there's no furniture, no large items that belong to this house that belong to the Austin family, there are many smaller items that we can actually look at to tell Alice's particular story. And indeed, we've done a lot of refocusing in this reinterpretation. It is much more about Alice, Alice's work, Alice's partner, Alice's friends, and less about the family that also lived there. Along the same time, we're also working with NYC LGBT sites to do more engagement in the community. And for community for us can mean Staten Island, it can mean New York City, it can mean LGBTQ populations anywhere. And so this is actually an example of a couple of those different channels where Alice Austin did an Instagram takeover of the NYC LGBT sites Instagram account, and we took a cardboard cutout of Alice called Flat Alice and took her on a tour of queer landmarks around Staten Island and Manhattan. And so this is an image of Alice visiting Audre Lorde's house. Audre Lorde also lived on Staten Island a fair amount of time later than Alice did. And then also the contemporary photography gallery has now become a little bit more dynamic, and also is currently hosting an Audre Lorde exhibit, and it uses, it's actually managed to secure a grant from the CARES Act this past year to do a virtual exhibit, so that even though the house is closed, you can still go visit it. These are stills from that. And in general, the Austin House has been working on expanding its geographic and chronological ties to the queer community, so that they aren't only stuck trying to interpret Alice's time period, but are also able to tie that to the larger queer community in time and space. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Marilyn.
Thank you. I'm Marilyn Keith Daly, and I am the site manager for, this is the Sarah Orne Jewett House Museum in South Berwick, Maine. Next, please. Next. It is the home of, actually, can you go back? Oh, thank you. It's the home of Sarah Orne Jewett, who is an iconic Maine author that's been used to describe her for a long time. And actually, she lived in both houses. She was born in the house you see on the left. And when she was 5, her family built a house on the right. And her grandparents stayed in the house on the left. And then when she was 38 years old, she inherited the house on the left and moved there with her sister and mother, while her sister and sister's family stayed in the other house. So the house on the left is the house we interpret as the Sarah Orne Jewett House Museum. Next. In 2017, Historic New England staff met and we discussed wanting to bring Sarah Orne Jewett more into focus on the Daly house tour and in the house interpretation. Next. We also wanted to bring her life, her work, into the house interpretation more. Next, please. And this, her decades-long love relationship with Annie Fields. Sarah's on the left there, and that's Annie Fields on the right. Annie Fields was a brilliant society hostess, and she was also a writer in her own right and a social reformer. She was interested particularly in women's suffrage. They met because Annie's husband, James T. Fields, was the editor at the Atlantic Monthly, where Sarah began her serious writing career, even though she had been published elsewhere. Next, please. To create the reinterpretation, I delved into primary sources, and we were really blessed that Sarah Orne Jewett wrote hundreds of letters in her lifetime. She wrote over 300 published works, and that includes novels, short stories, poetry, essays, children's work. So she was prolific. She kept a diary for a time. And what emerged from this primary source research was a young woman at first really questioning traditional roles, traditional female roles in society, and wanting something different for herself. In fact, she developed something of an aversion to marriage, and here in this one particular episode, she's comparing her cousin's episode, her cousin's marriage to death. Next, please. In her published work, over and over again, Jewett is writing about individualistic heroines who are breaking free from barriers, literal and figurative barriers. They're seeking freedom. And at the same time, Sarah is going through in her private life a search for love. She develops deep attachments to young female friends, and she falls in love. Next, please. So for on the Annie Fields aspect of our interpretation, next, please. This will give you a little clearer idea. So this was from a tour that was 30 years old. It was a good and scholarly tour, but at that time, the interpretation was different. This is the amount of space and breadth that was given to the relationship, Sarah and Annie's. So we have taken the interpretation from this, next please, to this. And this little piece of love poetry Sarah Orne Jewett wrote at the end of a letter to Annie Fields, on the very end of the letter, sideways, as right before she's signing it. And our guides recite this poem as we talk about their relationship and really fully explore the relationship in which Sarah Orne Jewett found the freedom to pursue her career while finding a mutually respectful and caring love relationship. Next, please. It was a curatorial collaboration as well. And in fact, one of the curators who collaborated with Sarah herself, this is Sarah's room. And it has essentially been unchanged since her passing in 1909. And if you can see there, right over the mantle in the center, a very small frame, it's much more prominent when you're in the room. Next, please. Sarah has positioned a couple of mirrors in the room so that from any vantage point you stand in the room, you can see Annie's portrait. We end our tour with a bit of reflection in Sarah's room. We allow people to come in and see Sarah's things and what Sarah found was important. And the reflection of the portraits is one of the key things. We end our tour too with a moment in time between them, a letter that Sarah wrote to Annie, and the changing from the dynamic of the then she had a stroke and died ending of a tour. We create kind of a timeless moment celebrating their relationship. So the tour was, reviewed. It had a scholarly review. The guides were trained and it was launched in 2018. We did a remedial evaluation and then made some adjustments and moved on. We continue with the next steps are partnerships in the queer community and programming that we hope will support our interpretation. And we're really proud to say that we received an NEH Cares grant, and we are feverishly working on a web application for the site that will launch in January. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Nicole Mello. I am a National Park Ranger at the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. Very excited to be here, both here at the conference and at the house. I've been at the house for almost 5 years now. When I first started, I had actually started as an intern while I was in my undergrad and at Lesley University, right next door to the house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And when I first started, my supervisor, Anna Christie, who's still my supervisor now, which is kind of awesome, had suggested to look into family members that I might like. And I thought, I'm really into queer history. That's what I want to study. And lo and behold, that's what I ended up studying. And she suggested that I look into a fella named Harry Dana. And that has led me to where I am today. If you could go to the next slide for me. So I started out just researching. I was an intern, I was very new. This was my first real like independent research project as a historian. So I was taking in everything. I read Harry's letters, I read his journals, I read his travel logs, I read his address books. And he's not the main person we interpret at the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. We interpret his grandfather, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet. We interpret George Washington. As you can see in the picture on the right here, that portrait that we have in the front entryway of the home, those two little boys on the right wall there, that's really all that we talked really about Harry on the tour. It's a portrait of him and his older brother. They're the first grandchildren of the poet. We'd pretty much be like, this is his lovely family, aren't they nice? Let's go into the house and check out what's actually going on. As I was looking into Harry Dana as a person, I was not only figuring out who he was as an incredibly prominent and interesting man in Boston who was a professor who people not only knew, but either loved or incredibly hated because he would speak his mind no matter what the scenario was going on. So I decided also in looking at his letters to present the evidence that I had found that he was in homosexual relationships. Before it was more like he's the grandson of the poet. He never married. He liked to hang out in the house. That's about it. In looking at his letters, I realized he was having relationships with men. He had a long-term relationship with two separate men, and this had not been interpreted really on tours, but everyone loves Harry Dana, so we got to talk about him a little more. I was able to not only get all this information, but I started putting it into programs, which is what you're seeing here. I was not only able to do a specialty tour on Harry as a person, just to introduce him and who he was, but I was able to also do a specialty tour on his sexuality, and eventually I was able to do one on his aunt's sexuality as well, Henry Longfellow's daughter, Alice Longfellow. And now we're just able to interpret on our tours, which is incredible. On our daily tours, we can now prove that Harry is queer. We can talk about it. If anyone asks, we can point to the letters, but we just say, this is the grandson of the poet. He was openly gay. He was living in this house for most of his life, and he's the one who preserved the Longfellow's entire legacy, excuse me. In doing all this exploration of Harry, sorry, go back. That's okay. I love these pictures of them. They look great. But while I was exploring them, like I said, they're the two that I focused on the most. Now we're finding out that there are several queer family members, including Henry's brother Sam, that we're looking at, but Alice and Harry are the ones that I've looked at the most. And so one of the most exciting things for me is that we were able to look into their lives and not only take Alice is the educator, Alice lived in the home, Harry is the preservationist, Harry is the professor, but we're able to say, look at this woman who Alice almost lived with. She would come and visit down the road because Alice didn't want anyone living in her house with her. A woman named Fanny Stone, who she was in a relationship with for almost 40 years. And if you would go to the next slide for me now. This is actually a picture of not only Alice and Fanny, but also Harry and a young man that he was in a relationship with named Carl Young. This is an incredible photo for us because this is two generations of the Longfellow family with their respective queer partners. It's Alice and Fanny and Harry and Carl all together. We know that even after Carl ended up marrying a woman and moving away, that Harry and Carl remained friends and that Alice saw him as a nephew to her. We know that after that, Harry began seeing a man named Glenn Carrington, who is a famous photographer and actually has his own archives in New York, which is incredible. So we also are fairly certain that Alice and Harry had a sort of understanding of one another, that they probably were open with one another enough to know what was going on in their home. So they were also able to support each other. So we can see through this that our queer history has always been there. It's still happening now, and it's still being made, and it will continue to be made in the future by people like us. If you would go to the next slide for me. And we can see that now, which is kind of incredible. One of our most exciting milestones for us as a National Historic Site is that we got to go to the Boston Pride Parade in 2019. Of course, 2020 Pride looked a little bit different this year, so it wasn't quite the same. But we got to go in our uniforms, and not only that, we got to bring Harry with us. My supervisor at the time, Garrett Clower, made this poster board of Harry, so that way Harry could attend his first Pride in the Boston that he loved so much when he was younger. I definitely cried. I was very excited. It was a big, not only like emotional moment for me, but also an interpretive moment. Like this guy that we barely talked about before, now his face is in the Pride Parade for people to see him and to see his name on the back and to Google him afterwards, which was incredible. We saw a big spike in people looking him up, which was awesome afterwards. And now that we've started stretching our hands out and joining with other organizations, it's not only just me and our archivists reading Harry's letters in the basement. We created a Cambridge Pride team and then a Boston Pride team. We have a Massachusetts Pride team now for the NPS, so we can continue interpreting queer history. And not only that, normalizing it, we're integrating it into the national parks narrative at as many historic houses and sites as we can. So now when you go, even on our website, you can see multiple videos and photos and articles and essays about the Longfellow family and various family members who were queer. Even right now, you can go to the website and check it out. Well, wait until after we're done. But this way we can not only interpret queer histories, we can integrate these stories into our common narrative. They've just been hidden and now they finally get to come out. So I think this can lead us right into our Q&A about other people's questions.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. We've got some great ones in the app here. So this is to everyone. Did you have the support of your board leadership in creating this program, this interpretation? Marilyn, do you want to start?
Sure. We absolutely had the support of the organization and the board. It was team leaders, as we call them at Historic New England, who were at the initial meeting and the decision to launch this reinterpretation. It also, Historic New England has and had at that time inclusion and diversity as an important organizational goal. So it fit with what Historic New England is trying to do.
Meghan?
So frankly, we did encounter some resistance in making Charlie's sexuality a bigger part of the interpretation. There was sort of two things that people were having trouble with. Some staff were feeling, which one was that we didn't have the evidence to say definitively that Charlie was gay, and two, that it ultimately wasn't our business. For the first one regarding evidence, I felt there were all kinds of clues about Charlie's same-sex attraction. And then when we learned more about him through the correspondence in Ogden Codman's papers, we felt pretty confident that we had enough proof, as it were. But to the question of whether his sexuality was fair game for interpretation, I thought that was a harder question and one that we wrestled quite a bit with. Ultimately, we decided that Charlie never tried to hide his same-sex attraction. He was open about it as much as you might consider in the 19th century. You know, people knew he was in relationships. He never, unlike some of his peers, he never got married. There are lots of family stories, some of which are apocryphal. So it felt like he was out. And because he didn't hide it, and also because we talk about heterosexual relationships throughout the house, it felt like this was fair game. And so what we tried to do is kind of keep it at the same level. So the amount in which we talk about heterosexual relationships, we use the same level of detail to talk about Charlie's relationships.
That's great. Nicole, you work for a large organization.
I do. I work for the federal government. So it's an interesting system in that we have, like, the government has their specific rules. The National Park Service has their specific rules of how we interpret, in that, like, we recognize climate change, we support pride, things like that. So that makes it a lot easier for us, is that, like, we have that umbrella of, like, you are supported when you do this. And I am also very lucky that I have my direct supervisors who are great for me, and I don't really have a board. We have the Friends of the Longfellow House who are a big part of our organization, but I don't have to answer to them. Like, if something had gone awry, we would have a discussion, but they can't fire me, which is nice. And luckily we didn't really have an issue with that. Whereas Harry Dana had an issue with the board in his time, the Board of Trustees. Like, we have not ran into any of that. We've had a couple of people have asked from the community, like, why are you interpreting these relationships now? Or, like, are you reading too much into things? I'm sure questions that we've all gotten before. And we actually, similar to Charlie Gibson, is that Harry Dana was pretty much out for the time. He never married. He was very open in his relationships, especially with Glenn Carrington, who was also openly out in his archives now. So it was, as we interpret Henry Longfellow and his wives, as we interpret Alice and her relationships and Charlie and his, we do the same with Harry.
Danielle?
Yeah, sure. So I have never had to convince the board directly, but I've interviewed several people who have, and they always emphasize the importance of doing the educational work. If you have a recalcitrant board, if you have a group of people that are involved in the governance of your site that don't understand why this is an interesting or compelling or worthy narrative, that it's an educational process and you need to move through it with care. But I also think that, incidentally, as Meghan was saying, it's also smart business sometimes, in that people are interested in compelling new storylines, and so it's actually can be really invigorating to a staff or to a board to hear that like audience might go up, grants might be achievable for if you're doing compelling new cutting edge history, and so like there's sometimes also like a practical argument to make there. But I also want to briefly address the closeting issue, which is that to point out that sexuality looks different in different time periods, and the construction of the closet is largely a 20th century concept. There are points in American history where sexuality isn't considered a thing that you don't have a homosexual or heterosexual person, you have homosexual and heterosexual acts, and so you're not thinking about, or they weren't thinking about this in the same ways that you're thinking about it now as you try to decide how to interpret. And so there's a lot of room to reconsider what marriage looks like in your house at different points in time, what sex looks like, what relationships look like, what domestic life looks like in general. And it isn't closeting people is not it's sort of often a misnomer for what's happening, because most of the time people were about as out as they felt they safely could be.
So I want to go on and ask a question of Marilyn and Meghan about were there any difficulties implementing new interpretation among the staff? Marilyn?
Yeah, that definitely had its challenges, and to do the training, we started with I started with small groups, and we have a really wonderful and really dedicated guide staff at Historic New England Southern Maine, and there was a great deal of concern. Everybody wanted to do a really good job with this, but there was, for some people who had interpreted the site for a long time, where we used to talk about maritime history, etc., there was a divide across. And in fact, during the remedial evaluation, I discovered that as I was interviewing a gay couple who had come to see the house, they wanted to really talk to me extensively because they had had an experience where the guide just backed away and wasn't using the language, and seemed to be just stepping back. In fact, she didn't want to use the word lesbian, and so we did a retraining, and we brought in a queer community partner, Seacoast Outright, a great group. They work with queer youth in the region and LGBTQ youth, and that really made headway, because we also had a staff get together where guides could talk about what their fears were, and a lot of a couple of people in particular, that was when they were able to express they were just afraid of saying the wrong word, and they was more politeness or trying to do the right thing and not feeling comfortable. So it was a journey.
It's a good point that this has to be part of your plan, is your training of the staff. It's key. Meghan?
I was going to, on the topic of being worried about saying the right or wrong word, what we did is that we gave our guides a sentence. Charlie was a gay man, although he would not have used that word to describe himself, as it didn't enter the popular lexicon until the mid-20th century. And we ask every guide, if you are feeling uncomfortable, for the most part, right, we give them a script and they can ad lib as they see fit, as they do research. But for this, we said, if you are not sure, memorize this sentence and say this sentence. We're sort of lucky because all of our guides are paid, and they're mostly college students or recent graduates. And so they're a little bit more, we have more control over what they say because we pay them. I was going to say also that they our guides for years, we used coded language on the tour: bohemian, Charlie was bohemian, eccentric, a bachelor. And so the visitors were always asking, well, was he gay? And so I think in some ways the guides were happy to be able to give a more full, complete answer.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. That was the part of the guide staff was like, thank goodness, fine, you know, help is on the way.
Danielle, do you have some questions from the audience?
Sure, yeah. We've got, how can we bring queer interpretation into spaces where it may not be immediately obvious, i.e. institutions focusing on industry or farming, etc.? And I'll start and then people can go around, but the beautiful thing about queer history is that queer people exist everywhere. Trans people exist everywhere. And so if you do your research, you will find a queer or trans story to talk about. This particular, right, like industry, right? There's the work of an oral historian, Annie Belay, I think, who does oral histories with queer and trans steelworkers in like the Rust Belt. And that is like, that's her jam, right? So like you can find it somewhere near you. And if you don't know where to start, reach out to a community organization near you, your Pride Center or something like that, a local university, and see if somebody there is already working in a strain that you can collaborate on.
And if you're looking at models, you want to model, look at Rosie the Riveter National Historic Park in California. It's an industrial site. But throughout the site, they interpret the lives of gay men and women who work there. And more state historical societies are integrating this into their march of their state's history. The Washington State does that. There are several others that are doing that. So as Danielle said, you could find the stories. Got a question, Danielle?
Yeah, this one's a little more, so do you have any suggestions for gaining support or soliciting stories or artifacts from the community for the purposes of doing this sort of work in a community that might be openly hostile to this subject matter? And again, I'll start and then we can go around. But I think a great place that you might want to look at and reach out to is the Glen Burnie Museum, which is actually a house museum that's part of the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester, Virginia. They interpret their historic house as the relationship of the two men that lived there most of the 20th century and made it become a historic house museum. And it's a fairly conservative area, and they've had to wrangle with that, but they've also reaped benefits from this new interpretation, including older people in the community coming to them and saying, if I had known who lived here when I was riding my bike by as a child, my whole life could have been different. So you can always find people in even those more conservative communities that need this information and need it more than some of the other sites that are having an easier time, you might argue.
Anyone else?
I've had a similar scenario where I've been trying to get letters that Harry had sent to his partners from the families of the people who their grandchildren who still have them. And some of them either don't see it as important, they don't know why we would want it. It's like, it's my grandpa's letters, you don't want this, or they don't want to be involved with the narrative. And so in that, it's been like a lot of persistence. It's been a lot of not only establishing relationships, but like you said before, Danielle, educating, not only educating ourselves, but educating the people that we're talking with about why this stuff is so interesting and important and why we want to be interpreting it. And I think that's been opening doors, even though that were closed before when we were like, hey, we want these letters, they're cool gay letters. And it became, hey, we want these letters, we want to fully interpret this person who is important to your grandfather. They're really important to this narrative that we're creating for the family.
Yeah, and I think partnerships, you know, if you're sincere about these, and these aren't one-shot deals, you develop relationships with organizations, you get to know people. Historic New England's been partnering with the History Project for a decade now at our Beauport, and we just did a program last week on Sarah Orne Jewett with the History Project. So I think those things, building relationships and showing that you're sincere and that you're interested in this history. And for those in your community who don't like it, well, kind of tough, because you're going to get this for your collection, right? And, you know, paper stuff, getting ephemera and that kind of material, that's easy to get. It's the other things, oral histories. You might be able to gather those. Those are important for you to have too. And again, maybe you need to partner with someone on doing this. But I think that's a great question. And Danielle, I don't know if they're going to kick us off, but our time is just over. Should we just keep?
I'll just talk until they make me go home.
Okay.
I think we can go a few more minutes, sure.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Nima. We've heard such wonderful case studies here about the opportunities that await when you fully commit to interpreting a queer narrative. Do you see opportunities in scenarios where the documentary record is more ambiguous but possibly queer? I want to start out by saying that a lot of queer stories don't appear so obviously queer when people start this research. A lot of this information is buried. Archives are disincentivized to talk about things like this. You can find strains of people who are sort of like scratching this out. You know, like Sarah Orne Jewett has, there's like a 1976 journal article in like a lesbian feminist history journal that's about her love poems. And it just sort of like floats there in space, being this thing that people can access if they know where to find it. But otherwise, you know, in the 1970s, that's not what the interpretation was at the Jewett House. It wasn't that in the 80s. So a lot of this, I would encourage people to do a little digging, and you might be surprised about what you could find.
And, you know, you present what you have, let the audience make up their mind. Meghan, you did some of that with, you know, telling what was going on in Boston and putting Gibson in place with that. I thought that was great on your tour.
Yeah, I feel like I think I saw this or heard about this from one of our colleagues who maybe at NEMA last year, but this idea of queer possibilities that, and I'm not going to, if someone else on this panel knows who I should be citing.
It's Margaret Middleton, and you can read about their article about it in the new JME issue that's coming out in December.
Awesome. It feels like basically, I mean, great. Yes. Good plug. We did another good plug. But this idea that, you know, just because it isn't there, you can open the door to the possibility and be thinking about that with circumstantial evidence, or I don't know, we'll read about it.
A lot of the conversation often pivots around this idea of, well, you assume that these heterosexual marriages were consummated. But what about these childless marriages? Like, there's a lot of assumption happening on one side and a lot of burden of proof being requested on the other side.
So I've got another question for all of you. What has been the response from the public? We didn't cover that, to your new interpretation. Nicole, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Ours is, we're lucky in that we've largely had a good response. We're in Cambridge, which is a fairly open-minded area. But we're also in Cambridge, which has some people who have been in Cambridge for a long time. They're Cantabrigians, they have their own name, they have ancestral homes. So a lot of them were not overjoyed that we took this house that they already had a pre-established narrative for in their head, and that we were introducing information that challenged what they already thought. And some people who had known Harry, he passed away in 1950. So we'd have people come to the house and be like, oh, I used to play on the lawn, I remember this guy. And I'm like, yeah, I'm interpreting him. He was openly gay. He did this, he did that. And they're like, I don't know about that, but I did see him. And I'm like, well, we can just move on from this. We don't have to talk about that. But it's become like, no, we can't talk about this. We have all this evidence. Just because this wasn't the narrative before doesn't mean it's not what happened, doesn't mean it's not the narrative. So luckily, we not only have that evidence, the queer evidence to fall back on, but we also have our confidence. We have the tour that we have established, and we have the support of most of our community and our higher ups, which has been largely good.
Meghan.
Yeah, the response for us has been overwhelmingly positive, and you know, at least for our specialty tour, the people who are coming are particularly interested. You know, they've self-selected to be interested in this topic. They're expecting a frank discussion of sexuality, and so that's great to have that community there. And even for our regular house tour, where we always say this, I think for the most part, people are expecting it. It confirms a bias that they have been developing as they go through the house, and so I think we are also, and there's just, it's not only is it good history, but it's bringing in new audiences. So sort of all around, it's been positive. Yeah.
Let's not forget that there's a whole queer audience out there that hasn't had their story told. And I've been in touch with people who are like, I am so glad to know that there are other people like me and there's a history there. So let's not forget that. Marilyn?
Yeah, we overwhelmingly positive, and with our guides staff too. There's a real feeling that there's real interest, and Sarah Orne Jewett writes so beautifully, and so when we hear her voice in the house, and we hear her talking about how much she loves Annie and another young woman in her life that came before, there's it's very refreshing, and it's very authentic feeling to hear Sarah talking about this. And I'll say one thing too, which is that, early on it was posed to me, what do we do if somebody brings a kid on the tour? What's going to happen? And the answer is, kids they're way past this. And that has turned out to be absolutely true. There's and parents, that bring kids into the house, it's great. It's great. And so that has been a real measure of success too.
I once gave a tour at the Alice Austin House before they fully revised, and we were mostly just doing a verbal insertion of Gertrude into the narrative. And I gave a tour to a man and his 2 teenage kids on like spring break. And I started talking about Gertrude, and the kids are looking at me like, yeah, okay. Like, yes, lesbians lived here, fine. And I looked up at the father standing behind them, and he is like, and he stayed that way for an extended period of time while I was talking. And I was so struck at how absolutely unfazed his kids were and how totally phased he was at this new information. And I'm not worried about the kids. They're all right. And there's nothing, if a historic house museum is doing graphic interpretations of anything, you might want to give people a heads up. A graphic interpretation of heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, violence, other sorts of things that are triggering or traumatic for people. But talking about people's relationships is not upsetting to people.
Right. And we're talking about love, and we're talking about families. And that that should be celebrated,
And remember, the reason I showed some of the slides that I did is because these kinds of topics of discussion about, people being offended by things, this goes along other topics too. It has to do with race and ethnicity. And, why are you talking about Sally Hemings at Monticello? Jefferson wouldn't have anything to do like that, which I have heard said. So this is across the field with new kinds of interpretation. So let's not forget that too. We can learn from one another at other kinds of sites how to do this. And there's good training out there online if you have questions about that. Sites of conscience, for one. Look at the National Park Service theme study on LGBTQ interpretations. It's excellent and gives a lot of great suggestions. So there are more and more resources out there. So thanks, everyone. I think they're kicking us out.
They are, but one last thing, we put together a resource sheet for you, which is tiny here, and you don't have to take a photo of it, because we also put a PDF on my website, my terribly poorly maintained website. But if you go to this daniellebennett.nyc and hit projects and papers, you can download a PDF of resources for doing this sort of work. And our email addresses are also on that PDF in case you want to reach out to us for more questions or follow-ups. So please go check it out.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I think it's probably time for us to sign out. Thank you all for coming. You know how to contact us now, thanks to Danielle. And if you have other questions, we'd all be happy to hear from you. So with that, everyone have a good night. I'm off for my cocktail.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Bye-bye.